Hello fellow guildmates, I am Brittany from Ugly Hand Dyes. I am going to walk you through my disc dyeing process. I'm going to start with a stencil and then do a hot dip, a glue bed, and some hand painting with denatured alcohol. I like to wash the disc beforehand to remove any release agent that's on there. So I just have had really good luck wiping it with acetone, and a cotton ball or a cotton pad would be fine too. Give it a nice wipe down here. I also like to get the bottom because I also spin dye the bottoms typically. Just nice and thorough, and you're good to go. It's ready. And then we start with our stencil now that we have our clean disc. This is the stencil I'm working with. This is my transfer tape. I use clear transfer tape and clear vinyl. It allows me to see the disc when I'm applying, which helps me with centering. Everybody does it differently. That's one of the fun parts of disc dyeing. I'm just showing you my way. After I put the transfer tape on, I smooth out any little bubbles and bumps with this felt tipped squeegee. Kind of do like a harder press specifically on the areas that have stencil cuts. Just be really thorough, make sure you get all those little spots, especially if you have any little tiny cuts, any small circles or small lines, you really want to hit those. I like to kind of angle it a couple different ways, make sure I'm getting in there really good. That should be good. And then you peel back the paper backing. I like to keep the vinyl side down and pull the paper up. And then if I get any little spots that are sticking to the backing, I just push that area down and slowly pull it back, make sure it's fine. This is fresh transfer tape, so it's coming up pretty clean. And then I have my stencil. So this is, at this point, I usually refer to like the computer screen. I have a grid on my stencil, and I will look at where the center of the stencil is. This particular stencil is a little bit more forgiving. It's not exactly a round design, but I did look and see where the center was, and I want the edges to be equidistant. So where the stencil cut is, I want to center around the edge. This is why I like the clear. It allows me to see where my stencil falls on the disc, and I can just make minor adjustments, just hovering it over without touching the disc. Once you touch the disc, it's game over. You have committed. Looks good. Everything's kind of equal distance away from the edge. I try to start with the center, kind of roll it out. Then I take my squeegee, start in the middle, push outwards. Smooth it out. I'm mostly concerned about bubbles that are in the design. That's the areas I want to focus on. And then again, it's just kind of hitting it at different angles and trying to flatten it out the best I can. Do have a little funny spot here, which I'll probably come back with this tool and try to smooth it out. That looks pretty good. Next step is pulling off the transfer tape. And then your vinyl is on the disc. I kind of stick down the corners so I can pull it up, kind of pull back slowly. Start at a corner and go at an angle. And I usually just stick this right back onto the backing, which I just threw away. And I reuse that multiple times. Basically, I reuse the transfer tape until it's got too many folds and wrinkles or a tear in it. I get a lot of uses out of those. So one roll goes a long way. The next step is weeding. I get great satisfaction out of weeding. It's kind of like peeling a sunburn. It can be very fun. Basically just pick a spot to start from and have at it. I like to use these precision tweezers for most of what I do. I tend to pick stencils that are simpler and bolder. I love to do an intricate stencil every now and then. I do like the challenge, but I think I tend towards functional disc dyes. These simple stencils allow for a lot more creativity and shading and whatnot for the hand painting. You gotta be really careful not to scratch the disc, holding it at just the right angle and using the tweezers only as needed. So once I pull up some, I use my fingers. It's a little bit gentler. Definitely want to be careful as you do this not to pull up the wrong thing. I tend to leave my design up on the screen. I fill the design in black too on the computer program so I can see what needs to be pulled and what needs to stay. Then I just usually have like a little pile of sticky vinyl next to me and I just keep adding to it. Once you get it moving, it kind of goes a little faster. I have found that pulling it up on the slower side tends to give you less sticky residue. So avoiding the temptation of once you got a line going, just yank it off. You can get some residue that way. So I try to keep like a nice consistent pull. I know this is probably tricky to see because I use the clear. You can use a light table too that can help with the visibility of this. But once you learn kind of how you gotta move around a little bit to get different angles, but it's pretty easy to see. See, a lot of dyers have like magnifying glasses and whatnot too, which can be very beneficial. I will probably be getting some eventually. Down here I have a whole bunch of tiny little dots, so I'm gonna take my, I don't know, I call it like a dental tool. I'm gonna take that and push down the spots that are gonna wanna pull up. Right in through here is definitely one of the more detailed part. Gotta go slow and make sure I leave the spots that are meant to be left. Also, if you choose stencils and you're just starting off with like hand painting or dyeing, starting simple, thick black lines are really helpful. Can make your life a little easier as you're learning, and then slowly work your way up to something a little more complicated. Sometimes you gotta go in and take like a razor blade and there'll be like a little spot that didn't cut quite right. You also want to think about like if you have something that's negative space, I have like a little reflection on here. So I want to leave that vinyl on there so that it's white rather than black. The next tool I use, like I said, I call it the dental tool. It's got this one side that I like to use the most where I can just go around all the edges and push them down, get rid of any bubbles, and help prevent bleeds from happening. I just literally go around and you kind of start like inside where the vinyl is and push out towards where you pulled it up, especially if you have a bubble or something. It will help alleviate that. The clear vinyl, the bubbles almost show up white rather than clear, so you can see where they are and you get to learn the materials you're working with. There's a lot of different methods that people use to prevent bleeds, get rid of bleeds. The best method is to have a flat disc that doesn't have a stamp. If you can get blank whites, your life is much easier. It's easier said than done, but that is the best way to prevent bleeds. Domi discs, you have to plan accordingly. I tend to make my stencils a little bit smaller and not reach the edge. So I'll kind of take my measuring tape and measure where the dominess really tapers, and I'll try to avoid that really tapered part if I can. So as I go around with this tool, I'm also looking for any little vinyl spots that maybe got missed. It's like double checking your work. And the more detailed the design is, the more important that is to do. I don't press down too hard. I don't want to scratch or damage the disc. You get a feel for it the more you do it, how hard you can press to get rid of the bubbles. This is probably overkill. I really go around every edge. A lot of times you can see the spots that need it, but I just go everywhere just to be sure. It's the biggest bummer when you're like, oh, this was so good, but I got this bleed. The middle of the disc tends to have a dimple, and that's a challenge for sure. I go over the whole thing, so even if you do get a bleed, it'll be a smaller bleed, hopefully. And also when you do pick your designs, I like to consider that as well. Try to get a design that either has a dark middle or doesn't have an intricate pattern in the middle. It's not always something that you can do, but if you have the option, consider your disc when you pick your designs. I think knowing and learning your limitations is a big part of disc dyeing, and sometimes people request things and you really want to make them happy and you really want to bring them the joy of getting exactly what they want. But every now and then I'll be like, well, it's not super realistic. There may be flaws or imperfections if we go that route. Sometimes I'll offer up other options or just warn them at least, like, hey, this could happen considering the shape of the disc or the design that you're choosing. And we are our own worst critics, A lot of clients aren't going to be mad about a small bleed, but we'll be really upset about it because we want it to be perfect. There is no perfection. I don't strive for perfection. I strive for having a good time, making someone a cool disc, learning. I try not to beat myself up too much if it doesn't turn out exactly how I planned, because they usually don't. And if I make a mistake, I just try to learn from it. Try not to repeat that. I did buy this stencil off of Etsy. It's pretty reasonably priced. Most of them have like a little statement that says, oh, you can make 1,000 of these or 100 of these or whatever. And I try to pay attention to that. I'm never gonna make 1,000 of any design, so it's not usually a concern. I feel like I'm supporting other artists a little bit, and I don't have to worry about copyright issues. Can become a thing. I know it's not a big problem yet, but being cautious of where you find your images and what art you use is on my radar. I did also edit this design a little bit. It was like a black alien, just like a shadow, and I added a line around him so that I could color him in. Just one more opportunity to shade. The struggle with finding stencils for me is a lot of times they color in the black areas that I would want to shade darker colors. So I really try to find images that don't have a lot of black already in them, which means you really have to use your creativity. Like, how would I fill this in? It's really a blank slate then. It gives you a little bit more creative freedom, but it can be hard to imagine, oh, how is this gonna look? Right now it's just lines, but if you're into coloring books as a kid, that's a huge advantage. I think I've pretty much gone around. Now I'll just look at it from different angles, make sure I got all the little bubbles. You don't have to worry about the bubbles where it's solid vinyl over here. I don't have to worry about those. You just don't want it right on the edge. That's where the problems are. That's where the dye is gonna go. I know when I first started dyeing, I was like, how much of this do I have to worry about? It's really just along the edges. I'm gonna get set up for a hot dip. I have found that hot dipping works better if I am going to use denatured alcohol to paint it in. I also do denatured alcohol sometimes and just brush it on, which is really nice if you have areas you don't want thin black lines to show up. But I do feel like it's more likely to bleed the black out when you hand paint it with the denatured alcohol. So the hot dip and a really good wash is very important for minimizing that risk. And that's the next step. All right, so we are ready to hot dip the disc with a stencil on it. I've got this pan with water and black eye dye in it. I've heated it up to the point where you just get the thinnest little wispies of steam, vapor, whatever. And so it's ready for the disc. I just take the corners, I fold them up, make a little disc bolt. Go around the edges. This will prevent hot dip from going over and leaking underneath the vinyl. And then when I put it in, I start on one side, down, and then slowly you put it down like this. So you start with one end, put the other end in. That helps prevent bubbles from showing up. And then you wait. I usually check it about every 5 to 7 minutes or so. Once you have that full black saturation, it's ready to go. You wash it and the fun begins. So it looks like the hot dip is done. I got really nice black lines for my stencil. You want it to be fully black. Since I'm gonna be doing a glue bed, if it wasn't fully saturated, you'll see those little swirls from the glue bed on the stencil. So you want it to be all the way dark. Get rid of the drips here. And then I'm going to wash it with a melamine sponge and dish soap and make sure I wash it really good. Then I'm going to take the vinyl off from around the stencil because I want that to be glue bed background. All right, now that I've washed it with soap and a melamine sponge, I'm just gonna take the vinyl off around the outside and leave the inner vinyl on. I like to pull up the edges first, makes it a little easier. Removing the vinyl is a little bit easier with like a little warm water, or if your disc is warmed up. It softens up the adhesive and makes it a little easier to pull off. There we have the background available and ready for a glue bed. Okay, I've got my disc here. I'm going to use a Lazy Susan turntable. You can also use a record player if you have one of those for spinning. We got press and seal. Will help you with cleanup. You can just pull all of your leftover glue and dye right out of the pan. Keeps your pan a lot cleaner. I'm gonna have a little cup with acetone in it. That's so I can clean my pipette. Always put your lids on. As soon as you open any lid, close it up when you're done. That's just asking for a spill if you don't. And then you start with your clear glue. Just aim for the middle and let it spread out. A slower pour seems to help reduce the amount of air bubbles that you get. And you want to make sure your glue is deep enough that you're not going to bottom out your disc. This is a fairly flat disc, makes it a little easier. This is a quick coat worm dip, which is a really great bright yellow. I did add a little lemon zest to it to really give it a little extra oomph. You gotta think in reverse when you do glue beds, especially if you want things placed in a certain area. Make sure you clean your pipette every single time. Got creamsicle here. I also like to dab off the excess acetone or any leftover liquids you got on there. Helps keep your dyes more pure. I'm gonna do a little overlap. I've got pansy, it's like a purple pink color. I'm gonna use that as sort of a transition from the orange to purple. If the orange meets the pansy, kind of more of a red color, whereas the purple and orange would make a muddy brown. Kind of a transition color for me. And I think I want a little bit up and around, putting the rest of the design. To take iris, put that next to the purple. Kind of going for like, you know, he's blasting off into space at night kind of vibe. I'm gonna go with shark blue. It's like a nice dark navy blue. I'm gonna put that at the very top of it. Kind of represent our space up here. I don't want it to get too dark, so I do want to add some lighter blues as well. I've got Sonic Blue. Sonic Blue is one of my favorites for glue beds because it doesn't seem to get quite as chunky as some of the other ones. Some of the blues like to add a little texture, which is fine when you want it. It can actually be a really cool effect, but if you don't want it, it can be a little bit frustrating. So Sonic Blue is a really good go-to for that. Got a little Caribbean Blue, it's very, very light. Got a little special mix here. Make it show up a little bit more. For this, I'm gonna use a straw. I like that swirly kind of, reminds me of like a bowling ball, like a neat bowling ball with the cool swirls in it. And then I'm gonna rotate on the Lazy Susan like that as I work my way around. With glue beds and a straw, I like to kind of take one color and push it into another, kind of spread them out lengthwise, and then I go and manipulate each area and give it the swirls that I want and be more specific then. I really like the silicone straw. It's I'm able to bend it so I can angle the air how I want to. I've got it all spread out pretty good, so now I'm going to manipulate it more specifically. At this point, you can add more dye if you feel like there's spots that need a little bit more. I should have plenty in there. It should be good to go. I will need a torch. Torch out any bubbles we have in here. There weren't too many. And then again, just like the hot dip, you're gonna place the disc down at an angle and then roll it in. I wanna make sure I line up my yellow where I want it. And then I'm gonna stick it in a dehydrator for about an hour at about 130 degrees. And then we wait. All right, I just wanted to give you a rundown on how to mix denatured alcohol with dye. You're gonna need denatured alcohol. These syringes are really helpful. Hot water, really hot water, and your dye. These are 2-ounce bottles. And for 2 ounces of liquid, you're going to need half a teaspoon of dye. These sample packages are 1 teaspoon. So I'm just gonna pour half of it in here. Personally, I don't always measure. Sometimes I just kind of eyeball it. And some dyes need a little more or a little less, but this is a really good baseline. It works for pretty much everything. Once you get used to it, you kind of know how much to put in there. Use my chart here, and I'm gonna need 1 teaspoon of water These syringes are really great because they have milliliters and teaspoons on them. You're gonna put the hot water in before you add the denatured alcohol. That hot water is gonna help activate your dye. So I like to give it a little swirl, make sure it's had time to really sit in the hot water. Make sure it's nice and saturated and as little chunks as you can get. And then you can go ahead and add your denatured alcohol to basically just top off the rest. I am gonna use the syringe again. It is very handy when mixing liquids. And then you're just gonna shake it up really, really good. Simple as that. These dye formula charts are very handy to have. Has all the different mediums on there and the measurements. And then it's ready to use. I do like to give lotions or certain things like a day to sit. I think they're a little bit more vibrant, but alcohol and acetone seem like they're good to go right away. All right, so I pulled it out of the glue bed and I washed it really good with a melamine sponge and dish soap. Getting the sponge in there and making sure you're like getting around the stencil is really important. It can bleed a little bit if you don't wash it really good. Just a little speck of leftover dye on there will cause problems later. So cleaning it really good is a very, very important part. And now I'm just going to start hand painting. I'm using denatured alcohol with Pro Chemical and dye mixed in there. I really like denatured alcohol because you can really control it. It's a little bit more gentle on the disc, which is a huge benefit. You can really work the colors in without damaging the disc as easily as like acetone, for example. I have damaged discs using acetone, so for me, the denatured alcohol gives me a little bit more allowance to really saturate and also have the control to shade and mix colors on the spot and really get intimate with the disc, honestly. So first I'm going to pick my starting point. I'm going to weed that and I'll start painting that way. I do want to do the alien earlier on. It's a little easier if there's some vinyl still left around them. So that's where I'm gonna start. Our alien friend here. I did want to show you also, I made a color chart. These are all the colors that I have in their pure form. It's really nice to have as a reference. It's also a really great way to practice and see how your dyes react to the plastic. Different dyes are definitely a little different from each other. So for example, the neon colors can be very difficult for me to work with when I'm hand painting. They spread differently and they leave a bit of a residue on there and it's a little bit harder to tell when you're saturated. So I tend to avoid those, or if I'm gonna use them, I start with them so the vinyl around it can stop the spread. But if you're a beginner and you wanna try denatured alcohol painting, I would say don't start with the neons and do a little bit of practicing on another disc. If you have a disc that's used or misshapen or just something that you can try it out on, it's a really great way to practice because it is a little different of a medium. Denatured alcohol is also a little bit more time consuming. It takes about the same amount of time as say lotion from start to finish, but with lotion you can paint it in and leave it for a while, whereas denatured alcohol, you're involved in the whole process. I really like that aspect of it. It gives you a lot of control and it keeps me busy. It keeps me doing something the whole time. Before I open this, I'm going to fill one little cup with acetone. That is for cleaning my brushes. And then I'm going to use a little bit of denatured alcohol. That is helpful for blending. Sometimes the paintbrushes can leave streaks or the dyes can leave streaks, and it's really nice to have denatured alcohol ready to go. Helps you blend things. I will show you that in action as well. It's nice to have a variety of paintbrushes too. Different paintbrushes just do different things. Right, I'm going to start with a green. This is actually a custom mix of mine. It is mostly lemon zest and aquatic green. One of my favorite mixes. I also dab off any excess on a paper towel, so I always have that handy. You really want to keep your paintbrush fairly dry for this. If it's got a lot of dye on it, a lot of medium on it, it can cause bleeds in the black stencil. I tend to just kind of scrape off the excess and start with just a little bit of dye. I am starting with the base color right now, so it's a lighter green. And then I'm gonna add like a little darker green around the edges to give it a little bit more shape. So the first layer goes on pretty light, and then it kind of like exponentially builds from there. Like I said, denatured alcohol does take a little bit more time. You want to be really deliberate with your brush strokes. Like if you have a shape that you want to be smooth, go with that shape. It is better to have less medium, less dye, less denatured alcohol on there than more. Once you hit that black stencil, it can bleed out on you. So you're really just trying to put just as much as you need time, and you can just layer and layer and layer until you get the saturation you're looking for. I have a fresh brush. I tend to start like in the middle when it's not by black and work my way out so that you don't have that dye sitting on the black stencil. It'll evaporate really quick. I can see I have a little vinyl stuck on here from when I peeled it off. A lot of times I'll take this denatured alcohol and the paintbrush and just try to work it off. I call them vinyl boogers. You just get these little vinyl boogers that you gotta get off the disc, and then I just wipe it onto the paper towel. You really wanna clean your brushes really frequently. A little bit of dye, like if you get a little bit of black from the stencil or a different color that you're blending, you wanna keep your brush really, really clean so you're getting like the pure color that you want to get. Also, when you dip back into your dye, you want to keep your dye really pure. So you just want to keep the impurities out there. So keeping the dye moving too, it helps it to evaporate faster. So I do a lot of like quick little strokes. If it sits, if there's like a blob of dye that sits in a spot, it can bleed out. But if you keep it moving and don't have a whole lot of dye on there, you can get away with touching the black a little more. And once you get to the saturation and color you're looking for, that's usually when I add a little bit of shading and other colors to it. You want it to look really smooth and even. That's how you know you're ready for the next step. If you can still see it's like streaky, then you just gotta add more layers. Kind of keep it moving to where you want it. A lot of people use like Q-tips too. That is totally fine. The precision tips are really nice. I've just always been a paintbrush person. I do it for spins and hand painting. There's no right or wrong way to do it. Like everybody does it a little differently, and that's one of the coolest parts about disc dyeing is I'll see somebody else doing something and I'm like, I never even thought to do that. I do it completely differently. I'm gonna go in, it's like I got a little flatter brush here, and it's really short, so it's much more controlled. And I'm gonna go around the edges and give them a little bit of dimension. I'm not like a trained artist. There's probably lots of YouTube videos you can watch on like how to shade and where to shade. I just like to make my colors pop and add a little dimension to them. So I'm gonna go around the edge. Wherever you want it to be the darkest is where you should start, and then you work your way out. As you have less dye on your brush, it'll be less saturated. Start in the darker spot, and then you can blend it out. It does take patience and time. I personally enjoy that part. Some people want to be more efficient and not spend all the time working on one thing. Trying to give them like a little chin here. Add a little shape to them. Kind of think about like where the light's hitting, like where there would be shadows, and that's where I add the shading. And you can really build it up with denatured alcohol, which is nice. Acetone is a little more aggressive, but you can also do it with acetone. And then a lot of times I'll go back to my original color and like smooth out the edges. So I'm gonna go back to that lighter green and just work from the inside out just to make it nice and smooth. DA kind of spreads on its own, just naturally. So you can kind of use that to your advantage and let it control where it spreads. Start from the inside and have it spread out. There can be a little film left behind. That washes away, so you kind of learn to ignore it. Giving them a little chin, a little definition. I'm kind of giving them some cheekbones, Go back to that darker green and give him like a little eyebrow forehead thing. A little dimension to his face. And then you can also use the DA cup, the denatured alcohol cup that I have there. You can use that as almost like an eraser. So if I wanted to add a highlight, let's say to his head, I could take just a little bit and you want to dab off that excess. And then you just kind of use it like as if it was dye. Add a little highlight. Now he's got like a little shiny spot. He's a greasy little alien. And then I'm gonna pick my next area to work on here. We'll do the shippies in. It's kind of nice. Sometimes I pull all the vinyl off at once, and sometimes I do it like this where I do it in stages. There's definitely benefits to doing it in stages. If the vinyl is left on, it stops dye from getting there, and it gives you a little bit more freedom to be a little bit sloppier with it. you don't have to worry about it bleeding into the next area. So that's kind of the method I'm showing you today. And eventually you will get to a point where there is no other vinyl and you just have to be more careful. So it's good to kind of pick and choose your areas that you do first. I'm gonna go into the ship and do some like grays, but I don't want it to be too bland. So I'm gonna add a little bit of blue to it, make it pop a little bit more. I like to think about functionality when I dye discs. So anytime I can add a little color or brightness to it, I lean that way. Really lucky I didn't really get bleeds around that middle part. This middle circle can be problematic sometimes, but with denatured alcohol too, you like really get to know your colors and how they respond. Some colors just take a few layers of dye and they're like fully saturated. Other ones take a lot of layers. That's one of the nice things about like this color chart I have. You can kind of see which colors are more aggressive, and when I actually did the chart, it was like really good to get to know the colors. I'm gonna start with a dark dungeon around the outside. You know, this is a spherical object, so I want the shading to be around the outside and then the bright spot to be in the middle and the front. I'm always really careful not to let my dyes get too dark. It's a really easy thing to do, to have your dyes get dark. I really try to go for that functional, like I can find this in the woods. That's why I use this yellow a lot. You can find that from so far away. Going in with a dark dungeon and hitting the spots I want to be darker. It's a very gray color. I'm going to soften the edges a little bit with the clean denatured alcohol so that when I come in and blend, you won't be able to see those harsh edges as much. I would say DA is somewhat similar to like watercolor. You can kind of use it a similar way and it applies similarly. Just trying to soften up the edges, and then I'll go in and keep going around with those dark spots. Kind of hitting the spots I want darker first and blend them out. Dark dungeon is one of the aggressive colors. I will probably water some down here shortly and I'll show you how I do that. Not water, but I use clean DA. So I am going to make a little custom mix here. I don't want it to be as dark. Dark dungeon is pretty dark. I want to lighten it up a little bit so I can blend it a little easier. So I'm gonna take a couple drops of dark dungeon in its pure form. And I'm just going to take some of this clean denatured alcohol that I have here, and I'm gonna do about a 50-50 mix. You know, in theory, you'd think I can just do a lighter, less saturated stroke, but it's gonna be really streaky if you don't thin it out with more DA. So that really helps make a smooth and blendable sort of mix. So you can see it's a lot lighter, a lot less aggressive. It's not going on quite as strong, which is what I want. But it's gonna blend nicely into what I already have because it's the same color. I like to over dramatize a little bit, like the edges, make them extra dark and then blend out to a really light color. I think it works well with the disc dyes. Kind of overdo it a little. Still just hitting the dark spots here, the areas I want the darkest. It's not gonna be quite as dark because it's not all the way in the corner. And smooth it out a little bit. Clean denatured alcohol. You got a little bit of time to work with it, but like the sooner you blend it. And then I want to add some blues to it. So I'm going to take a little bit of flag blue and add it to my mix. Maybe a little bit of shark blue. It's kind of a darker blue. It's a little bit gray undertone. I think it'll work nicely. This is one of the other perks of denatured alcohol is you can like mix it as you go. Just make sure you make enough of it. Otherwise you're like, how did I make that exactly? And you're gonna try to have to replicate the same color again. I'm also gonna go in with like a little bit bigger brush since this is kind of a bigger area here. Give it a little mix. Make sure it's nice and consistent. Still brush off the excess. Even though it's a bigger area, I don't wanna go in with a whole lot at once because that's how you get streaks and bleeds. Still a little bit darker of a color. Kind of working it around the edges, smoothing out streaks you could see before and blending it in with that dark dungeon. You're really just building, building, building. Building your saturation, your shading. And like I want that middle part to be nice and light, so I'm gonna hit it with a little bit of denatured alcohol, kind of make a little highlight there, and then blend it out. Since this is like the underside, I think it should be a little darker than maybe the top, but I still want the middle to be a little lighter to give it that dimension. Right around here, add a little highlight with the clean DA. I am going to dilute it a little bit more using more DA. It really allows for a much smoother transition if you dilute rather than trying to just put less layers there. Blending towards that middle spot that I want to be lighter. Still a little streaky over here, so I'm just gonna layering it with the bigger brush, smooth it out a little bit, working the edges a little bit more so that they're darker. And then I want to go in with like some blue highlights just to give it a little character, a little funk, a little bit of something to catch on the sun. So I'm gonna start with a sky blue, and where I left that blank spot. Sky blue is definitely a lighter color, so I don't need to dilute it. It's just ready to go. Very subtle color. You can build it up to be more noticeable. I'm gonna leave it a little bit on the lighter side since it's kind of my highlight area. Going around and smoothing it out. And go back in a little bit with that gray mix. Always close your bottles. Accidents will happen if you don't. I'll smooth this out a little bit more. Go ahead and add some denatured alcohol. You want to be deliberate with your brush strokes. Like I'm going long ways, because if there's a little bit of streaks in it, it'll go with the design. I like it to have a little texture. I'm fine with that, but you can get it really smooth if you want to. It's pretty flexible. All right, so now I'm thinking, well, actually I'm gonna gray up his steering wheel a little bit since I got this color ready to go. If you sit too long with the color in the palette too, it will evaporate and get denser. So I had a little bit of a bleed there. Totally fine, just go with denatured alcohol and clean it up as quick as you can, and you can blend it right back into the stencil. You can use it for shadows and stuff too, so you just gotta be deliberate with where you move your brush and where you put that darker bit of dye. The shorter brush holds less dye. You can be more controlled and use those for smaller areas. I think the flower would be fun to work on. Gonna do like an orange and yellow flower. Kind of match down here a little bit, tie it all together. Again, peel the vinyl kind of slower. Helps from residue getting left behind. And that residue will not get dyed. And then when you go clean it with Goo Gone, you'll have these little white spots. Be slow and deliberate. At the end, it's really tempting to just rip it off like a Band-Aid, but resist doing that. I'm gonna start with the highlights on this. I'm gonna do like yellow highlights towards the tips of the petals. Use my smaller brush, dab off the excess. I'm just gonna kind of like frame out where I want it to be lighter. I tend to start with the lighter bits and work towards the dark. Not always, you can really do it either way. Lemon Zest is a pretty bright color. It doesn't take a ton of layers to get that color in there. Want the inside of the flower just to have a little bit of red, dramatic effect. Blood red goes in pretty fast too, just a couple layers. Some of the stronger colors can be really streaky though, like they go in fast, but you gotta be more careful with them. I like these little flat paintbrushes because you can use it as like a wide area or like a really narrow area, and you can use the paintbrush shape, get the effect you want. And I'm gonna go in with Creamsicle to add some shading. Still using the same sort of wider brush. I'm gonna use this orange to transition from the yellow to the red. Add a little bit around the edges for a little depth. And then I'll go back in with like yellow and blend it a little more. So there's a little bit of back and forth when you do this method. I'm gonna go back to that yellow and blend with the orange a little more. You can kind of use other colors, or you can use the clean denatured alcohol. Just kind of softens it up a little bit. But if you're going back and blending in a lighter color, just gotta keep that paintbrush really clean. Otherwise you're putting orange or whatever color back into your dye, and now it's gonna be a little more muted. Sometimes you get a blob of dye and it'll start kind of bleeding out a spot. Just hit it right away. You gotta go back in with some DA. As long as you catch it quickly, you can erase your mistakes a little bit. Got a little bit of time to work with it. Really just going over it with that yellow and blending it. Try to hit the like highlight first when I go in with a fresh paintbrush. Where do I want it the brightest? And then I just work my way out. Basically just looking for the kind of brightness and saturation I want at this point. And we can work on his window. You can mix DA and lotion painting too. Like if you want areas that are solid, you can lotion paint that, or you can shade an area and then hit it with lotion afterwards, and you'll have the shading left underneath it. I think that's kind of how I got started. I would use like Dark Dungeon a lot to add some shading to an area and then paint over it with lotion, and it would add a little bit of effect. Now I like generally just do the DA. There's definitely different applications for it though. Give his window a little sky blue. It's a nice light color, a little darker around the edges where it's rounded. Start at the dark parts and work my way in so it gets lighter as I go in. Got a little gray on the brush. Just gonna clean it up a little bit, blend it out. All right, so that's the final product, all colored in and bright and fun. The last thing I do is clean all of my discs that I put vinyl onto with Goo Gone. Just take a paper towel, a little bit of Goo Gone. You can kind of feel when it catches a little bit, and once it basically feels all smooth, that's when you know it's all clean. And then you'll rinse it again with dish soap and water and a melamine sponge. Lots of washing goes into the process for sure. Once in a while I'll have to go back in and like there might be a little spot or two that need a little bit more color after I take the vinyl off, so you can easily touch it up with denatured alcohol. That's basically my whole process. If you have any questions or you're interested, the Dyers Guild has all the supplies that you need to get started and a lot of information there too. So I highly recommend checking that out. They've got a website, they've got a Facebook page, tons of resources, tons of really great dyers that you can chat with. Get into it, it's really fun. I'm kind of addicted to it. Highly recommend it. Thanks for watching the video.